Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 21st of May, 2024, and we are here to begin another live stream. This one entitled, as you can see, Zelensky's time runs out, and indeed it has. He is very much past his sell-by date, and we'll be going into that in a little while. But first, we must do our traditional greetings through the chat in a moment. Two pieces of business or administration, shall we say, before we get underway. Firstly, tomorrow evening, the live stream, same time, 10:30, will be dedicated to the third episode in our series on the book, the collection of works by Stalin entitled On the Opposition. And we're dealing tomorrow with the aftermath of the death of Lenin and the struggles that intensify within the CPSU-B, Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks, as it was to become, immediately after that. And then the next week to come, we'll be getting into the first really big post-Lenin controversy, which is a report from Stalin as General Secretary to the Congress of the party, dealing with the oppositional trend headed by, but by no means restricted to, Trotsky. So those are a couple of things we've got coming up on the Wednesday evening live stream. We also have coming up on Patreon initially, I'm going to be bringing back in monthly installments the World War II series. This was inspired after a particularly moronic set of comments made by a certain American alleged historian, a certain Mr. Timothy Snyder, when he was on stage recently and babbling away in the way that these people always do about, well, it might be a Munich 1938 moment, which will lead to a Poland 1939 moment. If Putin wins, it stops being 1938, it's 1939, or it's 1940, and Europe's going to be overrun. I know these people are propagandists, not historians, but Snyder is a particularly egregious example of a propagandist. I mean, he makes Robert Conquest look like a model of restraint. He makes even Anthony Beaver look more credible. I mean, these people's understanding, maybe understanding isn't the right word. These people's presentation of World War II and its causes, origins, etc., the actual history of the 1930s leading up to the outbreak of what the British refer to as the outbreak of World War II. Of course, I always have to point out the Chinese refer to 1931 as the breakout of World War II, and perhaps more accurately see World War II as stretching for at least 14 years. You could even make the argument that the war only comes to a close in 1952, as we have done on this channel before, with the final defeat of the Banderists and their CIA and MI6 paymasters. So bringing back the World War II series, initially it's going to be on a monthly basis and initially going to be on Patreon. And the purpose of doing that is to, in my own small way, address this complete bastardization of history that the likes of Snyder, and by no means just him. I mean, the aforementioned Anthony Beaver is another hideous offender. If you've read his book on Stalingrad, or the Soviet siege of Berlin in 1945 at the end of the war, then you will know what I'm referring to. Like, he repeats like every lie that originated with Goebbels. Anthony Beaver will repeat it in a English accent. So bringing that back, probably starting next month now, I would say. Further details to follow on that one. And if you haven't read it so far, I've just started reading the Grover Furr book, Blood Lies, specifically about Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands and the slanders of Stalin that Snyder indulges in that particular book. So read the Grover Fur book about Snyder's piss poor history, or Kotkin's piss poor history, which is just basically propaganda dressed up as history, and stay away from shady historians and their tortured World War II comparisons. Because as we will see, the value of these in terms of real historical analysis is practically zero. And of course, that's not why they're made. They're made to tap into the poor understanding that most of us in the West grow up with of World War II, and the cartoonish understanding of the 1930s that the education system deliberately promotes. Right. Greetings in the chat go to, so far, President Jesus, who has joined us from the perpetual dictatorship of Gavin Newsom. Tim Gray joins us and asks a question, which I will return to at the end of the greetings, Tim. Potted Rodent is with us. Jay, good afternoon to you. Ben joins us. Hello to you, and is actually off to bed. So hello and goodbye. Jeremy is with us, as is Lee. Ben says, Zelensky hysterically demanded that Western countries bring Russia to its knees at an ambassadorial meeting in April, according to Sergei Lavrov. Well, I'm certain that is the case. Abtin, good evening. Ben says, Zelensky is yelling at his generals when the topic of Kharkov frontline comes up. An anonymous aide told The Economist previous item was in TASS. Bad signs for Zelensky, certainly. Jawad, good evening to you, comrade. And good evening to Ian Foster. Good to have you with us, comrade. And Michael is with us, as is Austin from the American West in Idaho. CJ joins us from Route 95 in Virginia. SW Haster is with us, as is Colchester Ian. Anyone? Michael says, anyone see Ritter versus Karl Czar? Doesn't sound particularly inspiring to me. I respect the work of both of them, but also find both of them to be honest, crudely propagandistic at times. One for China and one for Russia. Tim Gray, you've clarified your question. I'll be coming back to that. Mutanda asks, you can never find out how many Palestinians died during the attack on October the 7th. Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know myself, but I suspect there are ways to find out. Taisa Ivanova, good evening from the East. Good evening to you. Otis joins us, as does Almir from Slovenia. Ash, good to have you with us. Finally catching a live stream after ages. Coming to us live from the other side, and indeed the other end of the world, already in tomorrow. Chris Casseroles is with us from Golders Green in London. And we have Luca with us, who says, a liberal colleague of mine was convinced that the US would help Ukraine become an industrial power on a par with Germany. That's not the first time that's been said. One of the big things that I think it was Kravchuk, the first president of Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He and others at the time were talking about how they were going to become an industrial power on a par with at least France. And at the time, they had, of course, what appeared to be a very impressive industrial base. But of course, it all got shredded and asset stripped and destroyed by the Ukrainian oligarchy. I mean, the fantasies that liberals are encouraged to believe in by the bourgeois press. I mean, why would the US ever help Ukraine actually build itself up to become an industrial power? The US has done this precisely, twice. Well, 3 times in actual fact. And each of them was conditional on the US being under an incredible amount of pressure from potentially being the capitalist Europe being swept away by revolution in the case of West Germany. And also in the case of South Korea, again, where they were faced with losing a very strategic foothold there if they didn't help South Korea develop industrially, which they did. Same with Japan. They had to redevelop Japan in order to fuel their war initially against the DPRK. And so in these instances, they were forced by the circumstances they were in, largely due to the presence of the Soviet Union and revolutionary China, and then, of course, the DPRK, to invest seriously and help these places develop. And that was in an extreme circumstance, or set of circumstances. If you follow that up, though, when each of these countries came close to threatening even in a small way, the economic dominance of US imperialism, then they were hamstrung and crippled. Like the Germans were made to pay for their own occupation in the 1970s. The Japanese, of course, there's the infamous Plaza Accords, and of course, the US essentially scalping and stealing their a large section of their tech industry in the late 80s, early 90s to do with chips, and setting the Japanese back and advancing their own chip making industries. So even where they have invested to build up former enemies that they needed to convert into solid allies, that was done at a very different time. And also when these allies developed to the point where it's in a direction the US didn't like, they went in and did their knees in, as they say. So this is just such nonsense that they put out there. I mean, the Ukraine's purpose we'll come to in a minute, but it was never to become an industrial power. I mean, God knows what your colleague's been reading, probably The Guardian, or I don't think even The Economist would be that crude, because they understand what's actually going on. Even though they lie about it. Spurious Furious, good evening to you. After Biden's defeat in November of 2024, Ukraine is finished. Well, that is indeed true if Biden loses. Colchester Ian says, Through Hell for Hitler, World War II book by Henry Mettelman, gives a look at the war from a German soldier's perspective, worth a read. Good suggestion. Thank you for that. Zain Mudassir says, South Korea followed Japan's model by forming shaebols, few families with government patronage control the economy. C. Bolt has joined us, and as has Jenny. Austin says, the American war in Vietnam also helped industrialize or reindustrialize Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, making artillery shells, bombs, etc. Yeah, that was when the US was fighting directly and was forced to, again, invest in these areas. We're in a completely different set of circumstances now. The other point to make is that back then, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, US capitalism was in a lot healthier, more of a healthy state. Now it's degenerated to the point of just advanced monopolization and seeking rapid profit through asset stripping. Investment is just simply not on the cards these days. And even with the pressure they're now under from the Chinese in terms of investing in industry, they're still not inclined to actually industrialize or reindustrialize even at home, even with all this threatening language that they're using. So the Ukraine's purpose was never to be industrialized. It was to be used for its human reserves, and that was it. So, okay, we then turn to nobody's favorite comedian, but certainly perhaps imperialism's second favorite comedian, second favorite, of course, behind John Stewart. Now, that is Ukraine, are facing a disaster. Zelensky's term is up. It's over. He's served his 5 years and will probably go down as one of the most disastrous holders of a presidential office ever, along with the people who used to run South Vietnam and probably Ashraf Ghani of Afghanistan. So Zelensky in deep trouble. But here we turn to Tim Gray's question about what defeat would look like in Ukraine. What would it look like for the West? Well, I would say two things on this question. The West has already lost several wars. They have lost in Iraq. They lost that war. They were forced to largely withdraw from it, and now the country, if it has outside influences clearly, and the US still retains some control over it, even though they've been forced to withdraw most of their forces. The biggest influence on the ground now is probably Iran in Iraq, but of course the Russians and the Chinese are extending their reach in there as well. So the US has already lost out there. They lost in Syria. They're keeping the war going in the north. They're denying the Syrian government the chance to fully reunite the country by continuing to promote the SDF, the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, predominantly the Kurdish forces, whose leadership has sold them out completely lock, stock, and barrel to US imperialism. Their US imperialists remain, of course, in alliance with ISIS, but the war has been lost. The war in Afghanistan was lost in a humiliating and degrading fashion. They lost due to the fact that, well, for many reasons, they never had any serious plan for actually doing anything with Afghanistan. Their whole plan was, well, we're going to extract what we can from it, and we're going to sit there and try and use it as a point of pressure ultimately against the Chinese and the Russians. That's why they stayed there. But the US, and this is an example of imperial rot and decay, the US, of course, couldn't even stabilize Afghanistan. They couldn't even build a government that would last if they didn't have a large throne of US bayonets to sit on for a few weeks. And that is due to the fact that US imperialism, again, advanced degree of monopolization, leading in part, along with catastrophic decline of the rate of profit, to a decay of capitalism at home, endless export of capital, and of course the vitality of US capitalism is completely sapped. It's a completely parasitic entity now. It engages in an awful lot of rent seeking and an awful lot of phony investments and stock price boosting, cutting corners. I mean, just look at the state of Boeing, for instance. And if you look at the state of the US occupation in Afghanistan, which has been very well chronicled, even in bourgeois sources by this stage, like it was the Washington Post that was covering the Afghan war logs, was it? Which was a chronicle of like corruption and incompetence. I mean, in the end, they were staying there just for the purposes of staying there. They weren't even really gaining much out of it. The whole occupation was a corrupt mess, and they had to scuttle out of there in a humiliating fashion. So they've been defeated multiple times, which made this gamble that they took in Ukraine even bigger. Now, there's other interesting comments coming in, so I'm going to draw other questions into Tim's comment, or my answer to Tim's comment. S.W. Haster says, I am also inclined to believe the Ukraine proxy war is capitalist ideological war to balkanize and divvy up the Russian Federation for the industries of the capitalist class. This is, of course, a very valid point, and it was confirmed by the one of the most pathetic European compradors, that is Kaja Kallas of Estonia. The Baltic yapping dogs, of course, are ruled by probably the worst compradors in Europe. I mean, that's some very stiff competition there. But if you look at the people who run the Baltic states, if you look at the people who run the characters like Maya Sandu, who run Moldova, all these people have happily run their own countries into the ground, happily overseen a catastrophic decline in the population due to mass migration, overseen a collapse in the birth rate, overseen the deindustrialization and asset stripping and destruction of the economy. And they're perfectly happy with it because they're getting paid. And so when people ask, well, how could people in the Baltic states or Ukraine or Belarus in World War II oversee the enslavement and destruction of their own countries? I say, well, there's people prepared to do that now. The ruling classes in these countries, and not just in these countries, in many, what you need to understand about a comprador ruling class is that it is always feeble. It arrives on the scene too late and too weak to do anything progressive. It therefore seeks the sponsorship of a powerful imperialist agent, a powerful imperialist power, and will act as their agent locally. And if the imperialist power requires them to turn their country into a burnt out husk, then they'll do it. They'll do it because they are from a completely degenerated class that cannot play a progressive role at all. And that was true of the Baltic ruling classes in the 1920s and 30s, and it's true of them now. Time has not improved them. The only difference between what was going on with the Hitlerite fascists and their occupation of the Baltic states, Belarusia, Ukraine, Moldova, places like that, and the bits of Soviet Russia they took. The only difference between the compradors they employed then and the ones that are employed now is that back then they were open, jackboot wearing fascists herding, the various victims of the Holocaust into gas chambers or machine gunning them on the battlefield. The compradors of this period came from a sort of slightly different set of circumstances that existed within the chief imperialist power. It wore this mask of liberalism. It talked about individual rights and freedoms. But if you notice that the economic processes that go on are broadly the same, just not quite as severe. Whereas Hitler and his gang were looking to enslave the Baltic states, other than for a chosen gaggle of compradors at the top, where essentially work the workers and peasants in these states to death, and then just move on like a plague of locusts elsewhere. So that was in its extreme form, and it was accompanied by mass slaughter. It was accompanied by open enslavement. So you fast forward 50 years to the 1990s, and what do you have within the compradors of Eastern Europe? You have the same thing is essentially demanded by American, German, French, and Italian, and British imperialism. Same thing is demanded. We want your labor ultra cheap. In fact, we'll export quite a lot of it, or import quite a lot of it, I should say, over to the west of Europe, where we can pay it dirt cheap and treat it like shit. We want your industries destroyed and assets stripped, lest they overcompete ours, and we want your economy reduced to an endless series of rent-seeking opportunities, and we're going to basically just turn you into an armed encampment on the border of the Russian Federation for our plans that we've got later on. That's why the Baltic states were invited into NATO. And for many of the people that run the Baltic states, they all have a background that's very close to the intelligence services of the USA and the British in particular. And so these are people who've been politically conditioned by both their class position and their political training to just throw all their entire nations into the furnace if ordered to. And the only reason that they haven't is that they haven't been ordered to yet. And you think that the Americans are going to shed one life to defend them? No. If the cards fall that way, then Joe Biden or Donald Trump will shovel these people into the furnace, just the same as they've done with Ukraine. The compradors, as Ash says in her comment, they're the most wretched type of ruler. They're the most despicable on earth. Again, comes from weakness, comes from coming about in countries that are too small and too weak, or classes that are outdated by the time they come to rule. So outdated relics of the feudal system, or small-time capitalists that can't possibly compete with the imperialists. They just seek to become loyal caretakers of a particular country. And this is what the likes of them are. Now, coming back to the initial question posed by Tim, what does defeat look like? Well, we've already seen defeats in various different places for them. However, you have to adjust here because they've seen so many defeats. The gamble on Ukraine was much bigger, and the prize, as Kaya Kallas actually indicates in her recent comment, was that they were going to be able to break up the entirety of Russia into microstates. That's what Kallas says. And Kallas, again, this is not just her ranting and raving. We know that these discussions have been had, We know because this is the kind of thing you see written about and discussed in the pages of not just the Daily Telegraph or the Economist or other like ultra reactionary journals in Britain, but you see it in the liberal press, you see it in the Guardian, you can see it in the New York Times, Washington Post, etc., etc. The plan was always to do as I'm going to describe now, which is take Ukraine, turn it into nothing but a giant outsourced military. So the idea being you build it up from the outside, you build up this military that can be used not to invade Russia or anything silly like that, or they didn't have that kind of mad of an idea. Build it up so you can deliver enough of a blow to the Russian armed forces. If you can bait the Russians into a war, which is what they wanted to do, bait them into a war, appear as if you've defeated them on the battlefield, even if you haven't. And then with a combination of that shock effect and the sanctions regime, this is why Zelensky's screaming and demanding that Russia be reduced to its knees by the West, because this is what he was promised. Okay, so he's promised that, and this was their plan. They thought that this would succeed. Cripple the economy with sanctions. They've been building up to it for 8 years by 2022 anyway. Cause a run on the ruble, cause the currency to collapse, confiscate all the assets of the Russian central bank held overseas. And I think some of that did reflect a certain bad mistake that the Russian government made in placing so many assets in European countries. I think the Putin government remained willfully blind when it came to the Europeans, blinded, I think, by the need that they had to keep on selling gas to them and keep on selling oil to them. The need to preserve those markets, or the desire on the part of the Russian government and the Russian bourgeois to preserve those markets, blinded them to the perfidious nature and weak nature of the European powers. That's slightly by the by, but this was the idea. And they had this plan in place, provoke the war, give Ukraine everything it needed to inflict what appeared to be an embarrassing defeat on the Russian armed forces in the field. Then by the time April or May had rolled round, you will have stymied the Russians on the battlefield. You will have caused the Russian economy to collapse. You will have mobilized your assets in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Again, do the same thing you've done every single time since 1989. When you've got your news crew out in Moscow and St. Petersburg, because almost nowhere else were these demonstrations going to be held, you do tight angle shots on crowds of telegenic young people carrying signs written in English saying, "Down with Putin, down with the dictator, we want freedom," things like that. And the way that they understood that this was going to happen was that this would be the trigger for some sort of palace coup or internal collapse. And this is what, to come back to the question, this is what was expected. This has not worked. This has not only not worked, this has gone disastrously wrong. So to come back to Tim's question, they've already lost. They've already lost. This war is already over. They have got to the point where not only can they not provide much more. And Zelensky keeps talking about give more weapons, give more weapons. Well, on this, I do agree with something Scott Ritter said. It doesn't matter how many that you give them. They don't have the men to run them. It doesn't matter how many F-16s or French, is it the Dassault fighter? And they're now saying they're going to train Ukrainians on. Send 20, send 30, send 40, send 100. Russians have the capability to shoot it all down. Again, so they've already lost this war. What's being decided now in the grisly killing fields of what was Eastern Ukraine isn't who's going to win. That's already been decided. It's how bad the loss is going to be for the West. And so to answer the question about the defeat, the only question is, does US imperialism try and hang on to any corner of Ukraine? There will be those who want to create a Banderistan in the west of Ukraine, around Lvov. Will the Russians allow them that? I don't think so. I think it's gone far beyond that now. So how does the US then massage this defeat? Well, that's the bigger question. But a defeat it most certainly is, and a devastating one. So the question is, how do they get out of it? Do they, and this is what I suspect that they will do, they will try, as I have said before, to just keep this going as long as they can. And here we get back to the role of Zelensky. Zelensky will probably be kept in place as long as he is useful, and he will be the one who now has to front up the mobilization of not just those in the 24, 25, 26 age bracket, but those all the way down to 18. In fact, I'm surprised it's been this long. Zelensky has apparently resisted doing this, mobilizing everybody down to the age of 18, because he's afraid of the response of that cohort when he tries to mobilize them. Like for the older men who he's mobilized, guys in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, early 70s even, they mobilized them, and a lot of those guys had already been through the military. So reacquainting them with military discipline wouldn't be too much of a challenge. For a lot of those who are like turning 18, 19, 20, like their first experience of military service is going to be tossed into a war, and a war with a very low survival rate, increasingly so. So Zelensky has been, I think, afraid, and with good reason, of the societal response if he throws this cohort into battle. So again, the question comes down to, or the answer to this question posed by Tim comes down to, can the US imperialists get Zelensky or whoever else they bring in to potentially replace him, Poroshenko perhaps, and will they then try to keep it? They'll then try to keep the war going at least until the presidential election is over. That will be the political men's motivation, and whether they can do that is another question. Whether they are able to mobilize the youth of Ukraine, or those of them who are even left in Ukraine. I mean, an awful lot have fled to Poland and Germany and Britain, and some to France and a few to the United States, but a hell of a lot to actually Russia itself. So again, the question isn't losing. The question is what the defeat will finally look like. I think the Americans will say to Zelensky, they'll keep trying to manipulate him via various different means. They'll say to him, keep it going. We'll give you everything you need. Just keep mobilizing. Hold on up near Kharkov and down in Kherson and everywhere else. Don't worry, we've got you covered. We're going to bring in, I don't know, insert name of miracle weapon here. We're going to give you 100 F-16s, flown probably by, maybe they'll try and pay a hell of a big price to like ex-pilots to come in and fly them. But unless they can find a bunch of guys who are truly desperate for cash, I can't see anybody wanting to fly face first into a Russian air defense system anytime soon. So they'll be promising Zelensky and the Ukrainians all kinds of things. I'm sure that there will be money moved under the table as well. What do you want, Mr. Z? You want a lifetime supply of purest Colombian? Well, we can get you that. You want a new pool in your mansion in Florida? We can get you that. You want more, I don't know, diamonds for your wife from a store in New York where she can go and insult the staff? Yeah, we can get you that. They'll be trying everything they possibly can to keep Zelensky in line and running this war up to the bitter fucking end, in the belief that, or not in the belief of anything turning up, but just to keep it going until they can bury the bad news the other side of an election. See, if it goes wrong after the election and Biden or whoever the Democrats put up for this thing has won, it doesn't matter. If it goes wrong under Trump as well, it also doesn't matter as much the political side of things, because then they'll just blame Trump. Now Trump's victory caused confidence in Ukraine to collapse. There you go. As soon as the votes come in, and if Trump wins, it'll be, well, as soon as those Ukrainians in the on the Eastern Front, as soon as they saw that I don't know, Iowa had gone for Trump, or as soon as they saw that Ohio had gone for Trump, or name a swing state, they looked at that on their phones. Those guys in the trenches near Kharkov, and they just their will to fight just collapsed, and they surrendered en masse to the Russians because they knew that Trump is Putin's agent. That sounds ridiculous, but I can imagine Hakeem Jeffries coming out with that, and Ryan Grimm nodding along sagely. Okay, so the defeat is, if not certain, it is near certain as I can be about it. We are in the middle of the defeat now. The only question is, how does the US dress it up? Now, for the US, it'll be slightly less devastating than for the Europeans. For the Europeans, it will be a horror, because suddenly they've gambled everything on this and lost. But this is the nature of the crisis. The US had to gamble big on defeating Russia and breaking it up and being able to asset strip it, enslave its people, and basically destroy it completely by breaking it up into however many states that the poisoned mind of the Washington policymaking elite can come up with, and leaving some crumbs for Europe in the breakup. Of course, they massively underestimated the durability of the Russian system and are paying the price for that now. So again, the question has to be developed into, well, what does defeat look like let's answer it in British terms. In American, dealing with the defeat in the United States, I think is a bit different because the United States still has more economic capacity than Britain does. In British terms, Britain, I think, will be the most fucked by it, other than France. France is pretty fucked anyway, mainly, but not exclusively, because of losing access to the neo-colonial system in Africa. Britain will be heavily associated with this defeat, even if we get in another, idiot of a prime minister in the form of Keir Starmer. Even with a change in leadership, this is going to be incredibly damaging, disastrous defeat that the British name is going to be heavily tarnished by. Because again, Boris Johnson is seen as the man who told Zelensky to carry on fighting, even though he was just an errand boy for the Americans. So it will mean that an increasing number of countries will, of course, start looking elsewhere for their alliances. Even some reliable compradors that the British have invested heavily in over the years will start to look east rather than west, which is why the Brits are desperate for this thing to continue as long as possible. But all they're doing is delaying the inevitable and, of course, causing mass death amongst the Ukrainians at the same time. Right. Okay. Let's just catch up with some further comments here from the chat. Right. Where are we? Ash says, "Compradors are so degenerate. I wonder with fear what their sex parties look like." My God. I think a lot of them were on Jeffrey Epstein's island. But if you remember Sanna Marin, that former idiot, former Finnish prime minister, like her parties that were recorded on one of her mates' cameras just look like a really lame university party. Like what you find is like these people are both degenerate and stupid, and a third factor, also very boring. And I've moved amongst like the lower ranks of these people in a previous life, shall we say, in Europe especially. Like I've moved amongst some of the European officialdom, some of these people who work in these bureaucracies. And the truth is they're not very bright. They're not very imaginative. They're incredibly boring. And they're not even satanic. That's the thing. Like if Alex Jones was right and it's like, these people are there, they are eating each other's babies, they are feasting on human livers. If it was that, then to quote Tim Dillon, the great stand-up comedian, well, at least they would be interesting. The truth is these countries are getting fucked and destroyed by people whose price tag isn't even that high. Like Kaja Kallas is going to destroy Estonia so she can sit next to Jens Stoltenberg. Fucking hell. like Maya Sandu and people like that, and our old friend Nikol Pashinyan in Armenia. Well, you'd hope that these people are on a massive payday for what they're doing, but I think that for a lot of them, it's there will be financial rewards in there for them. For a lot of them, though, it's just position seeking. Like they don't care if they're king or queen over a pile of ashes, as long as they get to be in what they regard as their proper place. They don't care if that is ruling over like a land the size of a postage stamp with a population of nothing. As long as they get to be, you got to get to shake hands with Emmanuel Macron and get told they're a very serious person and everybody loves them. I mean, the price tag for these people isn't even particularly high. It's like a moderately big expense account, a ride on a private jet. It's not even Satanism. It's not even that the bribes sometimes the payoffs are particularly big. It's just that they get to sit in the big chair and get to have people who these compradors' ideological makeup tells them that this is important. I'm being seen with Emmanuel Macron. This is important. He's the president of France. This is impressive. And again, I have some insight on this because I've met some of the junior ranks of these people, and like, without wanting to, I am by no means blowing my own horn when I say this. It was many years ago, 2000 and when was it? It was early 2011, I think. Yeah, early 2011. At that time, I was working for an organization that shall remain nameless, but it was in the British Civil Service. And for reasons that are too long and complicated to go into, I had ended up in Istanbul. And this isn't the beginning of the plot from an Orson Welles espionage movie, by the way. And I was there with a colleague of mine, and we were like two junior managers in the British Civil Service. We were not big time. We were on barely like, at the time I was earning like £24,000 a year, 2011 money. So it's like junior management salary in the British Civil Service. Not that great. And because we were working for this like civil service sort of foreign service thing, we would periodically get sent to various places overseas. And they would have us meet with like various different people who were like local hires. And this is who I ended up in a room with in Istanbul. And we were asked to give a presentation on how things are done in the British offices when it came to customer service management. And this guy who'd taken us over there, he like sprang this on us. And me and my former colleague, an old mate of mine, sort of looks at each other like, well, what the fuck do we do now? He didn't tell us that we were going to do this. He said, the guy just said, oh, just, wing it. So, I get up there and I wing it, basically, making sure I speak in the poshest accent possible, with as much received pronunciation as the 2011 version of me could manage. And we used a lot of long words, and we threw in every management and HR buzzword we could possibly find about, we said best practice a lot. And we talked about maximizing human resource development via the integration of new starters into a team based on a model of staffing that was dynamic, flexible, and also reflected the realities of the contemporary labor market. Bullshit. And I came to the end of it. We were speaking for about 20 minutes or so. And like, I thought, well, I thought to myself, I've just talked utter shit for like nearly half an hour. These people are going to think I'm a fucking idiot. And they should have done, because I was gibberish, complete gibberish. But the guy who brought us over there is going, yeah, that went great. They're really impressed. And like, people afterwards were from people from Bulgaria, from Hungary, from Ukraine, tragically, looking at us as if we'd just dropped pearls of wisdom off the top of Mount Olympus, which we hadn't. We'd just talk shit in not particularly upper class English accents either. We both have not strong regional accents, but we're not exactly, we're not exactly Roger Moore, who actually wasn't from the ruling class at all, but sounded as if he was. And it gave me this terrible insight. It's like, oh, right, we've just gone over there. We've stuck our suits on. We've talked in an English accent to them. We've used a lot of long words. And these people who were older than us and should have known better have been massively and overly impressed by all of this theater that we engaged in. And so this is when I say you underestimate sometimes these people, you overestimate them at your peril, which is like, for a lot of these characters who are socialized in this way, they're so impressed that they're meeting like someone from the Imperial Corps. It can be some tosser in a cheap suit from Manchester, and they're impressed by it. So if they meet, Olaf Scholz or Emmanuel Macron or Joe Biden, then they're going to, go head over heels and just say they'll do anything. Burn down the whole country, Mr. President? Certainly. If you think it's good for our EU integration. And it's when you realize the power of ideology, the power that even a faded imperialist power still has to impress certain layers of the population. It's horrifying. Looking back on it, that story's horrifying. I thought it was funny at the time, but it was clearly at a much lower level and much less developed politically than I am now. Now I look back on that and it's disgusting and horrifying, because in a small way I got to see how the British imperialists do maintain themselves. Because yes, it is based on a real power, i.e. the accumulation of gigantic amounts of capital in the city of London, and that is a very real thing that power is based on. But it's continually extended by winning over, ideologically speaking, these characters who go on to run these countries and sending con men over there to spin them a line of bullshit and get them to destroy their countries on the basis of a promise and a nod and a wink from some fucking arsehole from England or France or Germany or the United States. So that's the confessional story out of the way for tonight, But yes, it's this is the grisly reality. Right, Zain Mudassir says France is even losing New Caledonia. Yes, New Caledonia. We are going to have to cover this in more detail. I did say I would do. Probably going to be Friday by the time I get to it. Maybe it may be worth doing a special earlier stream. I'm not sure. But I am going to come back to it. Importance of New Caledonia, asks Zabtin. I believe it's a place where there's an awful lot of, I think it's nickel mining goes on. It's one of the biggest nickel mining, extraction points in the world. I think that maybe Musk has been there. I'm not sure, but certainly this is something which is more than symbolism. It's a real economic benefit. And if they lose that on top of losing Africa, I mean, there's people in the French ruling class who already want to throw Macron off a cliff. That's why he's going all in on crushing this thing. Dennis Curry says, shit, my uni parties were lame, probably. Well, so are mine. Don't worry about it. All uni parties are lame, University parties are, you go in thinking you're going to basically be, I don't know, reenacting the last days of Rome. And I don't know how many of you on this are familiar with the British series Peep Show, which is something of a sort of iconic series over here. It looks like that. That's like what British university parties end up looking like. It's very sad, nerdy guys, of which I was one, being unable to talk to women for often 4 hours at a time, getting more and more inebriated until the point where communication becomes impossible. And then either somebody takes a swing at somebody and misses, or basically you just end up lying on the ground, vomiting everywhere and saying, oh, it was great. It was amazing. I threw up everything. It was like foaming and red. It was fantastic. And then you lie to yourself that you've had the most amazing experience ever. despite the fact that you have just demonstrated the fact that you should probably never drink again. Ben says, talking about boring, imagine a party with 360 degrees of Annalena Baerbock. Jesus Christ. I mean, she's another example of like, that is what you call, that is a colonized person. That is a colonized mind, and colonized by the United States. I mean, we could probably do like a good hour of or more talking about like the certain trends on the German left which creates people like Baerbock. Because I mean, I've run into some of these people over the years. Like there is like that, not just like the most extreme version of it is like the anti-Deutsch, pro-Israel Antifa types. But Baerbock's like a sort of slightly more watered down version of that. But that is like a trend on the German left that's been there since World War II, which is just to reject Germanness entirely, but then live vicariously through the imperial power of somebody else, i.e. the United States. Yes, the Alex Jones impression is getting better. Ash says, yeah, I overestimate the intelligence of compradors and bourgeoisie due to their degeneracy. Their culture is boring, and even the evil they produce is lame. It's actually a comforting truth. SW Hater says, a validation contest from the status quo. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Marius says, I think some of them are truly satanic level of evil, like Bill Gates and Soros, etc. But they are exceptions, not the rule. Most are pathetic mediocrities. That's true. Most are just employees, higher paid employees, but officials, functionaries, nonetheless. Yeah, the word satanic is it should be reserved for people who do at least merit it. I mean, Bill Gates is an evil motherfucker. That's no doubt about that. A man who his entire fortune was started by essentially stealing the work of others. Like if you remember, it's his open. I think it's called his open letter to hobbyists or something, where he basically says in this early letter that you lot have created this stuff, but I'm going to copyright it, and that's how I'm going to make my money. And that's what he did. Copyrighted a lot of other people's innovations. And so like he's always been a massive piece of shit, and time has not improved him. And by the way, we still don't know exactly what he was up to on Jeffrey Epstein's island, but I think we can guess. So yeah, that guy might actually merit the sobriquet, shall we say. Yes, Ben says, my God, this reminds me of some corporate workshops I was tortured at. These corporate consultants are just as stupid and easily impressed. Oh yeah, it's the thing you got to realize. Like, there's a reason why people go into consultancy. It's because they are like the better consultants are con men, because they've realized that there's a grift there that you can milk for years. Like I knew people when I was in the civil service, like senior consultants brought in to do like big jobs. Some of them were on a day rate of like £2,000 a day, and they'd be working for months and months and months. And they produced a lame report at the end of it, which was like, well, if you want to talk about efficiency, maybe a 37% cut in staffing in this particular unit would actually help to reduce overheads by, 68% and drive further efficiency savings into the new financial year, which could, of course, be then reinvested in a new innovation budget, which would require a new flexible employment model to drive home the benefits of the previous savings rendered via cutbacks in long-term staffing. Write that, deliver it to some fucking bozo in the HR department who'll go, oh, it's marvelous. Pay this man £60,000. Or, you get to be an IT consultant where you do not actual practical IT work like designing anything. The big one to get into is, of course, IT strategy, where you write a strategy paper, which basically is a long-winded justification for outsourcing everything that moves and saying, oh, well, we could get it done cheaper in India. That's always the conclusion of these reports, for which you are paid tens of thousands of pounds for a few months' work, where you basically just come back and say, hey, let's fire everybody and move it somewhere else. Morgan says young Irish officials are sent to workshops and conferences with young Central European leaders of the future and are starstruck in the same way you described. Yeah, trust me. Also, I know many of you will know this. The education system not worth being impressed by. The values it actually inculcates in people are, as Morgan's comment there implies, to be impressed by bullshit. I mean, if your education leads you to be impressed by the next Olaf Scholz, then that's a poor education. That's a big waste of money. Being impressed by junior losers, but this is what they do, and this is the education I went through, and it took me a long time to get over it, because you are brought up in the imperialist countries and the imperial core countries to have all the wrong values, to be impressed by all the wrong things, to regard your life in such a way as to cheapen it. To be honest, you cheapen yourself by engaging in the things that these scumbags want you to engage in, to pursue a form of self-interest that cuts you off from any essential humanity you have. You can call it soul-sucking if you want, if you're inclined to believe in an immortal soul. But this is the way that you are trained. This is what we were trained to be, our generation, who went through the university system graduating 15 years ago. You're trained to essentially be a backbiting, bullshitting scumbag who basically, if you're clever, you can charm and oil your way up the public sector greasy pole, relentlessly cutting down that pole behind you so nobody else can crawl up after you. You get your way to the top by selling out everybody else around you, by backbiting, by betraying everybody else around you. And you justify it to yourself on the basis that, well, I'm carving out my little slice of something to take care of my particular family, and then I'll raise a bunch of kids who'll fucking hate me anyway. And, then they'll go into it and do the same thing. It's an utterly self-defeating process. And I'm very glad I realized it before I got too far in. How the fuck did Alex Jones climb over that wall at Bohemian Grove? Don't know. Maybe I should ring into his show and ask him. Ash says, I had estimates that New Caledonia holds between 6 and to a quarter of the world nickel reserve. There's an awful lot. Jenny loves Peep Show, as you should. It's a classic piece of British miserableism. Abtin says you should have partied with us. Well, I was always sure that I was going to the wrong parties. But I think fundamentally I just maybe I just don't enjoy parties very much. Dennis Curry says Scott Ritter says scratch a German, get a Nazi. That's a silly comment. And it's the kind of comment that makes me not take Ritter particularly seriously. Because again, it shows a lack of understanding as to, of course, Ritter's not a Marxist and he doesn't claim to be, but it shows a very poor understanding of what made Nazism and what makes imperialism. I mean, Ritter's an odd one because he'll admit to all kinds of things. He'll admit that the Banderas were employed by the CIA after World War II. He'll admit that they waged a secret war against the Soviet Union in Ukraine. And yet he still goes back to basically defining that the Germans have still got a Nazi problem. No, of course, the Germans have an imperialism problem, of which Nazism was the most extreme manifestation. But what can we say about Scratcher Brit? Scratcher Brit find a Churchill? Because he was pretty damn close to a British version of fascism. I mean, the problem isn't a particular nationality. The problem is the imperialist system that promotes all the things that make the most rabid and wild forms of fascism. Until you address that, then you're not addressing anything. So it's a silly comment, and it just shows Ritter's political cluelessness at times. Netanyahu is satanic. Well, yeah, well, he is a complete bastard. But then again, look at like the lame little twat that he produced, Yair Netanyahu, who is just like a completely pathetic, low rent scuzzbag. So this like titanic evil bastard in Netanyahu, who's his son and heir? This is a pathetic little bastard who's like trying to trade trade access to a prostitute for like money in some recording with him and his little friends. It's like really fucking pathetic stuff. Rupert says Dali did the artwork for the Rothschilds Satanic Ball. Dali was a fascist, so that makes sense. Right, just moving through here. Pittsburgh Dude 87 says, look how successful Robin DiAngelo has been with her white fragility corporate consulting con. That's a great gig to get in on. Like, if you want to make money, find the next thing that HR departments will force on people and write about it. And for Robin DiAngelo, she really hit the crest of a wave there. You know, have a white woman come in and tell you about white fragility. Have a white woman come in and say, hey, here's how to spare black people's feelings. You know, it's just like ridiculous. But hey, somebody paid for that shit and she made a lot of money off it. Marius says, quite correctly, Robin DiAngelo is one of the biggest frauds of recent times, along with Ibram X. Kendi and Kimberly Crenshaw. Yeah, it's like a complete grift. It really is like, I mean, I'm not surprised by it because even 10 years ago, 14 years ago, when I like got started in the civil service, they were already putting us through like the worst kind of like bullshit that I thought it was pretty bad at the time. Now it looks comparatively restrained. Now they'd have like some white guy come in who tells us he identifies as a woman 3/7 of the week, and he also identifies as black, and will like weep on demand or something. It's like, but yeah, the grifter that these people found was incredible. Right, just scrolling through the comments here. Okay, so the point to finish off on here, because we've been going about an hour, is that to look at the case of Zelensky. Zelensky, to quote Lukashenko, acts properly. Because I mean, Lukashenko made a good point. He said he acts properly by demanding things from the West because he was promised everything. He was promised, if you stick with us, we'll give you everything you need to win. And he stuck with them, and what happened? A complete disaster. A complete disaster. This is of course, this thing will condemn him in the end if he gets out alive. But the fact that he's now reached the end of his term, I mean, they don't have many options for who they can swap him out for. I mean, Poroshenko is even more despised than Zelensky. Zelensky apparently doesn't want the job, and I don't blame him for once. So whoever has to front this up is going to end up with a massive target on his back. So they'll have to make sure that the bribes for Zelensky are particularly big. I mean, the question now is, to go back to the point about what does losing look like? Well, it looks like what's unfolding now, but the only question is like, well, how quickly and how badly does it happen? Do the US manage to hold on to this thing until past the election, until they can blame it all on Trump? Or possibly. That might even be part of their planning here. But the the cynical brutality, I think this is the point to draw a conclusion from the discussion about both Ukraine and the comprador tendency. The cynical brutality of the ruling class, any ruling class, towards their own working class population is to be expected. They're the only class capable of actually really caring for the nation, as in the masses, as in like the people of the nation, is the proletariat, or in some cases an alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. That much has been revealed by the events of the 20th century, by the revolutions of the 20th century, be it Soviet Union, be it China, be it Cuba, be it Vietnam, be it Korea. It is in all of these places where the people, the masses, who are the nation, have genuinely been elevated and have genuinely been part of the development of those countries. In all of the places where the compradors have reigned, with the exceptions in terms of industrial development of those places the US was forced to develop after World War II. And even there, you look at the nightmare society they created in occupied Korea, or the nightmare society they ultimately created in Japan. And you can see the devastating long-term consequences of imperialist domination, even in areas where they successfully developed the industrial base somewhat. So the only, to go back to a point that is made often on these streams, the only way to save any of these countries is to engage in the complete overthrow of the compradors and the removal of imperialism. That's the starting point. And the capitalist classes, of course, of all these countries are completely incapable of doing that. You see the struggles that the Georgian bourgeois is engaged in just to pass one simple, quite straightforward law about foreign agents. You see that the Armenian bourgeois, despite mass opposition to Pashinyan, is unable to remove him because they don't know what the way forward should be. And they are more in fear of the Armenian masses than they are of getting the whole country swallowed up by Azerbaijan under the guidance of Erdogan. So again, like you see in all these countries, like these capitalist classes, they're just completely incapable of taking the country forward at all. They have nothing positive to do, no positive role to play. Even in countries where ruling classes have brutally crushed and they hyper exploited the working class, like in Britain, at least after that brutish period of primitive accumulation, you can see a benefit out of it in terms of building up a powerful industrial base, as was done in this country. Not in the countries we've been talking about tonight. That just simply does not happen, because again, like these bourgeois were brought into existence at a time when they had no progressive role left to play. And for that reason, even if a bourgeois continues to exist in any of these countries for much longer, if the proletariat is actually reactivates and, as it inevitably will, moves into political action again, then even if a bourgeoisie is to survive in some form for a while, it will have to be one that is completely, has all power removed from it, where it is subjected to the dictatorship of the proletariat and is at the very least subjected to the old Chinese formulation, the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, which draws from, of course, Lenin's formulation. The democratic dictatorship over a bourgeois, which is obliged to take direction from a proletarian party and a proletarian state, because again, they have absolutely no progressive role to play. Again, like not just in Ukraine, but you look at again, or in many other countries where capitalism got restored, look what they did. That led to the death of all of these nations. It's only due to the unique combination of circumstances that the Russians have got through this and are now coming out of the other side of it, with a good deal of help from Joe Biden as well. Nothing killed off the compradors in Russia quicker than the combination of some elements of action taken by the Putin system. But the compradors really got a kicking from the U.S. imperialists when they started sanctioning their wealth in the West. So they killed off the social basis for their own agents in Russia, as I've said before. Right. Right. Okay, so we are going to bring things to a close here. If we have further comments, please be sure to email them to me. I will, of course, get to them in future Q&As if you want to put in a more detailed comment or question. Again, like future stuff, I'm still working out how the Patreon shows are going to work, but I am going to be doing an update on that quite soon. Join me tomorrow for the discussion of the Stalin work on the opposition. Third episode of that series tomorrow. Join me on Thursday for my discussion of the flaws, very deep flaws, in the Trotskyite theory of permanent revolution. And on Friday, we'll be doing our probably round the world look at various different things involving the revolt in New Caledonia, the developments in the Sahel, the war in occupied Palestine, and maybe we'll have more on Zelensky's end of job experience. Maybe he'll be getting an exit interview to carry on the HR theme of this show. But until tomorrow, thank you to everybody who has tuned in. Be sure to like and share this stream if you haven't done so already. But until tomorrow, I will bid you good evening.